When it comes to land, Montana is one of the biggest states in America. Montana is even larger than Germany is in terms of area, but it's vastly smaller when it comes to the size of population. Because for all its huge amounts of space, Montana's a pretty desolate place. If Montana were an independent country, it would be in the top 4 lowest densities in the world, right in the company of countries like Namibia, Australia, and Mongolia. All of the US states around Montana are pretty much just as desolate and empty as well. To the east, there's North Dakota, which is about equivalent to Washington state in geographic size, but which only has about a tenth of Washington's population, despite them both being at about the same latitude at the top of the continental US mainland. And then there's also South Dakota, which is extremely sparsely populated as well, with about the same overall population density as North Dakota. There's only about 900,000 residents who live within South Dakota. And then of course there's also Wyoming to the south of Montana, which is America's emptiest state after Alaska and the least populated state in the country, despite being the 10th largest state by area. The strangest part about how empty this part of the middle of Northern America is that immediately across the border further north into Canada, where you'd expect the climate to be even harsher and colder and the population to be even smaller, it's actually dramatically larger and a lot more densely populated instead. Alberta's population is nearing 4.7 million people today, nearly as much as all of Montana, both of the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Idaho all combined, which further makes Alberta more than twice as densely populated as Montana is, despite both of them being interior landlocked regions and Alberta being much higher north in latitude. South of the US-Canada border, there are many reasons why Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming became the emptiest part of the lower continental 48 states. It is an area that is almost entirely west of the 98th meridian line of longitude, the imaginary geographic line that roughly divides the wet and humid environment of the North American continent in the east from the dry and arid environment found in the west. Nearly anywhere east of this line in the United States, farms can rely more on natural rainfall and less on artificial irrigation, which means that in a broad sense, food can be produced more cheaply and in greater quantities that can sustain larger population bases. At the very frontier of where this line cuts across the continent and divides the wet east from the arid west, you can find a nearly perfect trail of frontier cities straddling the divide immediately before everything becomes arid, like San Antonio, Austin, Fort Worth, Oklahoma City, Wichita, Lincoln, Omaha, and the aforementioned Sioux Falls and Fargo in the Dakotas, and Winnipeg further north into Canada. East of this line in these frontier cities is the overwhelming 80% of the entire American population, and west of it is the remaining 20% scattered across only islands of dense populations in between vast and largely empty distances in places like Denver, Albuquerque, El Paso, Salt Lake City, Boise, Tucson, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and the heavily populated but narrow US West Coast. This is the result of numerous geographic and climatic factors all working together that shapes where people are actually able to live in the North American continent. But further to the north, right across the border in Canada, the historic, geographic, biological, and geological factors have all been just different enough to make it a much more densely populated region than either Montana or the Dakotas today. Probably the single most important geographic feature of Canada that's determined where Canadians have lived for centuries is the Canadian Shield, a vast expansive area that covers nearly half of the country and which constitutes the largest mass of exposed pre-Cambrian rock that can be found anywhere on the planet. So when the first European settlers came to colonize Canada, they obviously encountered the challenging to settle Shield as well, and so they concentrated around the very strategic St. Lawrence River region, which historically was navigable by ships from the Atlantic Ocean as far inland as precisely where Montreal is today, where a series of rapids exist that impair navigation any deeper into the North American continent for centuries. The prairies in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta were separated from the core of Canadian civilization by more than 1,200 kilometers of the barren Canadian Shield, running through nearly the entirety of Ontario. The western coast of British Columbia could be reached by ships early on, but the towering Cascade and Coast mountain ranges blocked off any easy access from the immediate coast any deeper into the Canadian prairies from this direction as well, which made the prairies in central Canada difficult for the Canadian government to access from just about every direction. But as American settlers began expanding westwards into the continental United States and started building out railroads to bring in even larger numbers of settlers, the Canadian government felt the pressure building to start sending their own settlers out west as well, to finally begin populating their western provinces with Canadians, before they ended up being looked at and potentially settled first by Americans. Several Canadian expeditions were sent out to survey the lands of the Canadian West in the mid to late 19th century, with one of the earliest being the Palliser expedition between 1857 and 1859. That expedition came to the conclusion that Western Canada beyond the Shield could be broadly divided into 3 separate regions. A cold, coniferous forest region in the north covered by boreal trees and peat bogs that was too inhospitable for agriculture. Another region in the south that became known as Palliser's Triangle, that's essentially a semi-arid steppe biome and an extension of the vast American Great Plains. And most interestingly, an extremely rich and fertile but narrow band in the center between them that was perfect for settlement in between the coniferous forest in the north and the semi-arid steppe of the south that became known as the Aspen Parkland region. Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, and Winnipeg were all founded within and around the Aspen Parkland belt and its signature Chernozem soil type that enabled this region of the country to become the breadbasket of Canada. Huge amounts of crops like wheat, oats, and barley are grown here today, while large numbers of cows and sheep are raised within the more arid Palliser's Triangle region. Consequently, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta account for more than 85% of Canada's total amount of arable land, which means that, probably unsurprisingly, more than 80% of Canada's total agricultural output comes from this region of the country as well. Simply put, the agricultural potential and output of these more northern Canadian provinces is vastly higher than the American states further to the south, like Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming, largely because of how ridiculously rich and fertile the soils found in the Aspen Parkland belt that arcs across them is. Moreover, the barren Canadian Shield isn't just entirely contained within the borders of Canada either. It stretches down to cover nearly all of northern Minnesota beyond Minneapolis, along with much of northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan as well, which severely limits the ability for settlements in this part of the United States to grow as well. People had known that there was oil in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin for centuries before that time, but the true extent of exactly how much oil was there wasn't really well understood. A few oil wells had been constructed around Calgary between the late 19th century and 1946, but production was fairly minor and inconsequential on a global scale. The sheer scale of the bitumen crude oil found in the Athabasca oil sands was vastly larger than anybody had previously believed. Together, the Albertan oil sand reservoirs contain an estimated 1.7 trillion barrels of bitumen in place, which, to put into perspective, is roughly comparable to the rest of the entire world's proven reserves of conventional petroleum all combined. Bitumen production out of the oil sands in Alberta has since contributed to the province, producing more than 80% of all the oil in Canada, which has further enabled Canada to rise from being only a minor oil producer throughout the first half of the 20th century to being the 4th largest oil producer in the world today as of 2022. Vast sums of oil money has been flowing into Alberta for decades, which has transformed the province into the wealthiest part of Canada on a per capita basis. The oil money that has come pouring into the province has been used to dramatically develop and expand Alberta's schools, highways, and hospitals, which has boosted the province's Human Development Index or HDI score to being literally the highest in all of Canada. The HDI is a comparative measure of things like literacy, education, personal income, life expectancy, healthcare access, standard of living, and overall well-being of citizens that is compiled by the United Nations. So, ultimately, because of their proximity to the rich and fertile soils of the Aspen Parkland belt, and their proximity to the massive Athabasca oil sands and their good rail and air connections to the rest of Canada and the United States, and because of the very high quality of life that's present there that has followed, the Alberta-Edmonton corridor far to the north of the US border has evolved into the second most densely populated region of Canada, remaining only behind the old Quebec-Windsor corridor itself in the east more than 2,600 kilometers away. The Calgary-Edmonton corridor has since become the home of more than 75% of all Albertans, or a little more than 3.2 million people, which is greater than the population of the greater Vancouver metro on the Canadian West Coast, and is roughly equivalent to the combined populations of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming further to its south. And that is all why the Canadian population further north of Montana and North Dakota is a lot denser than the American populations are further to the south.